You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon.
Video and eyewitness reports.
The big question now is it murder or stand your ground?
Trayvon, he's just trying to get home.
Stand your ground laws.
You can use deadly force in response.
Stand your ground law.
The shooter says he had no choice and claimed Florida's stand your ground law protects him.
Welcome to Unshut Cases. On today's episode, we have with us an incredible attorney out of Atlanta, Georgia, Jonathan Ross, out of Ross & Owens, Ross Legal. Jonathan, welcome to Unshut Cases. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Thanks for being here. My name is Attorney Jonathan Ross, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia, born and raised. I'm a true Atlanta Falcon fan as well as Bulldog fan. I've been practicing now for almost 13 years. Ironically, I was inspired to be an attorney by the TV show Matlock.
Why didn't you say anything about this before?
I was worried about Patty's reputation.
Oh, come on!
Before we dive into more about this case, we're going to hear a few words from our sponsor.
Mission Control, USS Legal Soft, ready to launch. Yes, copy that. LegalSoft's mission is to find the best legal talent for our client, even if we have to go to the moon to find it.
And we're back with attorney Jonathan Ross speaking about the Stand Your Ground law. Your law firm, it's family law, state, criminal, PI, and general civil litigation. And Fayetteville, Georgia, you guys do an incredible job there. I know this specific case we're going to be talking about today, you were actually quoted and brought into the local news to be, get your perspective and your take on it as an expert. So we're talking about Stand Your Ground, which is a legislation that I'm going to let you speak to because I know you are going to know way more about it than me in detail. But for me, the big one that obviously was the national story was from 2012 with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, which we are going to get into. But just to kind of give the audience a brief background, 38 U.S. states are Stand Your Ground states, all but 8 by statuses providing that there is no duty to retreat from an attacker in any place in which one is lawfully present. Stand Your Ground laws are frequently labeled shoot first laws by opposition groups. In Florida, self-defense claims tripled in the years following enactment. Texas A&M study found that when whites use the Stand Your Ground defense against black attackers, they are more successful than when blacks use the defense against white attackers. According to the Urban Institute, in Stand Your Ground states, white on black homicides are 354% more likely to be ruled justified on white homicides, even though they are more common by over 72%. So obviously that speaks to a lot of problematic angles of this law itself, and I do want to dive into all of that. To get into this specific case that you were brought in on, which is pretty new, it was just a little over a year ago. This was in Ellenwood, Georgia in April of last year, I believe.
Correct.
17-year-old boy along with 2 others broke into a car in an attempt to steal it.
A homeowner and a teen are now both charged after the homeowner shot at a group of teens trying to steal his car. According to DeKalb County Police, the homeowner confronted the teens. The shooting happened early this morning.
They were confronted by a 30-year-old resident who opened fire and shot the 17-year-old boy while the other 2 fled. The boy was taken to a hospital with non-life-threatening injuries, although I think they were very serious, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And the 30-year-old man is facing an aggravated assault charge since Stand Your Ground law would not apply to the situation in Georgia. Stand Your Ground law only protects the car if someone is inside or getting in or out, not if you're far away and a threat is not approaching you. So I want to start there because you and I talked a little bit about this before we even got on. Can you actually touch on that point to start of just defending property, right? Because that's kind of a central part of this case. And just how does that come into play here?
Sure. So going a little bit of background on the Stand Your Ground law. The law was enacted under the overall principle of self-defense. Essentially, the law says a person has the right to defend themselves, others, as well as property against the attacks of others. Now, what gets a lot of people in trouble with that situation is that the force used must be reasonable in light of the situation. A reasonable attack must be met with reasonable force. So if a person's coming at you to punch you, you can't just pull out your gun and start shooting. Even though you are lawfully in your right to stand there and defend yourself, the force will be considered excessive based upon that circumstance. So drawing to this Ellenwood situation, the homeowner came outside, discovered there were some 3 teens who appears to be breaking into his vehicle. Well, in that situation, he decides to pull out his gun and shoot at them, thinking, okay, I have the right to defend my property. And that is usually a very erroneous, or there's a lot of nuances to defending your property. In that situation, the homeowner is facing the charge for aggravated assault right now, and it could easily be arisen to attempted murder in that situation because he was shooting at these teens were breaking into his vehicle. He was nowhere in any kind of threat of his life being in danger. And when anytime you use any kind of deadly forces, what a firearm will be considered, you have to have reasonable fear of losing life or grave injury coming to you or someone else before you can actually just exercise your right to use that gun.
Yeah, and I remember when we were talking a little earlier, you mentioned, in a hypothetical scenario, if he had come out with mace or something that was just not a deadly weapon, the situation would be much different. But because he's coming out there with a gun and firing, it's like, obviously seems like not only an overreaction. Obviously, someone stealing your car is not what you want to be happening.
Right.
But at the same time, you're then now attempting to kill somebody over, and a kid, really. I mean, we're talking about 17-year-olds. They're not even, adults, really. So
correct. And in that situation, I mean, don't get me wrong. As someone who goes out and works very hard every day, nobody wants to see that their hard-earned, items being stolen from them, from someone who just comes and takes.
Sure.
So as a human, I 100% understand wanting to defend your property. But as I go back to it, especially as it pertains to stand your ground, you have to use reasonable force. So you're correct, Dan. If that individual, that homeowner had came out with mace, even because there was multiple assailants, even if it had been a baseball bat,
right,
and just literally just almost to the point of just being able to defend himself if they did come at him, he would be in a strong situation. Also, even in that situation, had the intruders or the car thieves actually came towards him or came somewhere threatening towards him, even especially with the fact that there was three of them, he would have a stronger case of even using his firearm because it's 3-on-1. You're trying to even up the odds. So would that still be a absolute defense? No. You still could be facing some very hard road in front of you to prove your innocence and to prove but as the law would say, your justification for using force, but you still would have a lot stronger case in that situation.
Yeah, and you brought up something interesting there, which is the idea of the kids who were going after the car going at him, which they weren't in this case. But obviously that kind of comes into play. Were they coming, toward or intimidating you or going after you or not? Right. And I bring that up because I do want to touch on the Trayvon Martin case a bit, because again, that's like the most high profile version of the Stand Your Ground. It was a national news story 12 years ago. This was in Sanford, Florida. Just to kind of give background to the audience here, this was with George Zimmerman, who fatally shot Trayvon Martin, 17-year-old kid, African-American, who was visiting his father. Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch coordinator for the gated community where Martin was visiting relatives at the time of the shooting. Zimmerman became suspicious of Trayvon Martin and called police. This was a specific thing I remember when this case happened, because he mentioned that a bunch of times. He was suspicious without, to my knowledge, ever describing what he was suspicious of, other than it was raining and he was in a hoodie, which to me is not suspicious. That's just someone walking in clothes.
Correct.
Called police, which I think told him to stand down and not follow this kid. After some sort of interaction that had been highly disputed, Zimmerman shot him with a pistol. He was licensed to carry. There was a physical altercation. 5 hours later, Zimmerman was released. Under Florida's Stand Your Ground statute, the police were prohibited by law from making an arrest. That I didn't know, actually, till I'm looking at it right now. In a widely reported trial, this was national, Zimmerman was charged with second-degree murder for Martin's death, but acquitted by the jury after claiming self-defense, although Martin had no weapon. The incident was reviewed by the Department of Justice for potential civil rights violations, but no additional charges were filed. Zimmerman had made nearly 50 calls to police between 2004 and 2012, it's excessive, to report various local disturbances such as loud parties, open garage doors, potholes, and children playing in the street. Martin had been on the phone with a friend moments before he was shot. This friend later identified Zimmerman as the aggressor in the deadly confrontation. So,
correct.
And you and I spoke before we got on this whole podcast too about this one, because you were living, I think, in Jacksonville, Florida at the time, or you were up there when this whole incident happened 12 years ago, right?
Correct. I was living in Jacksonville and literally just at the start of my legal career when this first happened. And so this case definitely grabbed national attention as well as local attention, especially being Jacksonville is only about at most an hour and 15 minutes away from Sanford. So very close proximity here. And that's someone who's also been very big in mentoring youth and especially young black males. This one even further hit home. But as far as the circumstances surrounding this, George Zimmerman was a local neighborhood watch person. And the issue where we come with Stand Your Ground is the premise of Stand Your Ground was, and to kind of differentiate it from the original, its predecessor, which was the Castle Doctrine, which gave people the right to protect their homes. It was literally the castle doctrine was limited just to homes, where stand your ground makes it where anywhere you are lawfully allowed to be, you can stand your ground and defend yourself. So in this situation, what caused a lot of, in my opinion, discord was George Zimmerman, by the sheer language of stand your ground, was not standing his ground. He, as anyone who has watched the case, saw that Mr. Zimmerman was following Trayvon Martin. And despite the police repeatedly saying, hey, stop, do not give chase, do not pursue him, he ignored him and kept following him until eventually, as I believe any rational person would be, if I see somebody following me, I'm going to stop and say, hey, what's going on here? And that's what led to the confrontation, which another premise of stand your ground is you cannot be the initial aggressor and claim stand your ground, which in this situation is, in my arguable opinion, Mr. Zimmerman was. He's following Mr. Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin's done nothing other than look suspicious, but that was never ever articulated what the suspicion was.
Right.
The best address I can give you. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining and he's just walking around looking about.
He follows, Zimmerman follows him, and then naturally there does become a confrontation. George Zimmerman pulls out his firearm and shoots Trayvon Martin, and now we're sitting here with this story. But the overall challenge with that same situation is they actually going a little bit deeper in that case. That's been the misconception. People believe that George Zimmerman actually raised the stand your ground defense. Actually, further details, he never raised it actually in his trial. He was initially released on it for that 5 hours, but once they did further investigation, which can happen in these cases, and the prosecutor decided to charge him, even in this actual trial, he never did raise stand your ground. He just raised principles of the law and set under the overarching self-defense, which is where a lot of people believe, and all legal pundits believe, that's why he was found not guilty. So they found him not guilty, not understand your ground, but on the overall self-defense.
Yeah. And again, that was a while back. This other one from Atlanta is newer. So I think you had mentioned this case in Ellenwood, right? This is still ongoing. Like this case, this person is still
being prosecuted, correct.
Okay. And where is that just in terms of the process of that trial?
And that's what also makes these cases challenging, is that even if you are potentially correct in your stand your ground analysis, if the prosecutor, first and foremost, if the police feel that there wasn't justified, they still can arrest you. And once you're arrested, as this homeowner was, now you're involved in a legal case. And legal cases, with it being a felony involved, the prosecution has up to 4 years for a felony to charge you, up to 2 years, and these are all based upon Georgia, up to 2 years to formally charge you on a misdemeanor. So with this being aggravated assault, they have up to 4 years to actually formally charge him. So right now he's likely out on, I believe last time I checked, he's out on bond, waiting for them to decide whether they're going to formally charge him with aggravated assault, or they're going to up it to maybe attempted murder, or they're going to lower it down to a lesser included of just simple assault or something. He's in limbo waiting to find out what's going to exactly happen to him. And if he gets to that point and they formally charge him and he doesn't they don't offer him a acceptable plea deal, he's going to now be facing 12 individuals to decide his fate.
Yeah. In terms of the stand your ground law itself, can you just tell us initially, because you mentioned castle doctrine, and there was already things kind of in self-defense, there's these things that are in place. What was the intended purpose of this legislation? Where did it kind of come from? And what is sort of the concise definition of this law in the eyes of the court?
Sure. So originally, the original self-defense protection was the castle doctrine, which a lot of states still have a version of, but they've actually just modified it and expanded it, understand your ground. So under the castle doctrine, it goes to that old adage of a man's home is his castle.
Right.
And so you had the right, lawmakers felt like, hey, if I'm in my home, I should not have to flee my home in the event that someone comes to us to do damage to me. Because before that, they had what's called a duty to retreat, which means if there's an attack coming in my front door, before that castle doctrine, I was actually, if I could get out the back door, I was expected to run out my own house where I pay the bills, to run out the back door and get away from it. So they came up with the castle doctrine. Well, that worked great, but this lawmakers still kept going, if I'm just sitting at a barbecue, if I'm sitting out eating dinner with my wife or just, anywhere, and someone comes up and starts trouble with me, or actually even worse, comes to try to do harm to me, I shouldn't have to run away because I was lawfully there. Did nothing wrong.
Sure.
So that led to the creation of the stand your ground, which gives you the same protection to protect, like I said, yourself, others, as well as property from the attacks of others. It's just, we always hear stand your ground under usually deadly force situations because that's when usually it's going to be invoked most often. Short of a deadly force situation, most people just say overall self-defense and leave it there.
Yeah. And to your point, it's being able to defend yourself, not giving you the right to go initiate and become the aggressor.
Correct.
Which again, in the George Zimmerman case, he obviously was, in my opinion, being the aggressor and the initiator.
Correct.
And you did kind of touch there on sort of the difference between that and self-defense, or that initial castle doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
The case that you were brought in to speak about in Ellenwood, we touched on a few of those elements there. Were there anything else that were missing, sort of nuances? Two of the kids fled. They didn't get shot. He shot one of these kids. What happened with the 17-year-old who was shot? He wasn't killed, but he did face serious injuries, was hospitalized. Can you just kind of speak to some of the other facets of this case, how it happened, and anything else we might want to know about it?
Well, sure. So that young man actually, because he's technically a juvenile, he's in the juvenile system. So as of my last check on this matter, he had not been he had not been charged as an adult yet.
Okay.
So by that being that under those same situation, his files are sealed and locked under as a juvenile because we want juveniles to have a fresh start in the event that they when they get to an adulthood. So those files have been actually, like I say, that case has been sealed. But now in the event that they do formally charge him or take him from juvenile court and charge him as an adult because he's 17, he's close enough to be charged, then that case will actually be open. They could pursue him likely for grand theft auto. Depends on how far they were getting in the vehicle with that. But even with that circumstance, in all honesty, in my legal opinion, had that homeowner came out with some mace or something to those lines, this young man had not been injured the way he was.
Yeah.
He was just arrested.
Sure.
He'd be on a stronger. They basically, in my opinion, there'll be a harder prosecution of him.
Gotcha.
Because in some circumstances, the law kind of goes, hey, you've been shot,
right.
So you've learned a little bit of your lesson here. So we're not going to go as hard on you versus when you are completely innocent in the matter.
Right. So there's context, obviously, that's
Correct.
we're human beings. It's like what happened is going to come into account when people
Correct.
are thinking about how to sort of prosecute these cases or then proceed with the next steps of it. In this case, we mentioned the perpetrator, the person that shot the kid, he was actually not able to cite stand your ground to justify the shooting. That is correct, right?
Correct.
And that is because of what we just kind of talked about, the fact that they were, at a distance at the car, they were not coming toward him. He did use deadly force basically against these 17-year-old kids. In the Trayvon Martin case, 2012, that case itself brought stand your ground law to sort of the national conversation and public attention. Can you kind of speak to that just in terms of, obviously there's a lot of reasons why it was so incendiary and kind of lit the public consciousness on fire about this. Can we just kind of like talk a little bit about why that became such a big national case and what precedent was that kind of setting at that time?
Well, yeah. So anytime, this, because stand your ground, if I'm just talk about parlor talk, just going out, if I'm on my day-to-day life and just bumping into people until they, especially once they find you an attorney, they have questions for you. So they just kind of always want to know about stand your ground. Just some kind of always comes up. Mm-hmm. And going back to the Trayvon Martin situation, well, first and foremost, you got a 17-year-old kid being killed here.
Yeah.
In Sanford, Florida, like I say, it's not a real urban area. It was kind of just drew national attention, especially when it was circling around the fact that Zimmerman said, hey, he was suspicious just from being in a hoodie.
Right. And
we can't forget in the midst of racial undertones here, even though I believe George Zimmerman is half Hispanic, half white, still, he was killing a young black male. And it just drew the attention because it gave people questions. Okay, wait a minute. If you're standing your ground, and when you read the facts and he's following him, how was he initially I think the fact that he initially was able to say stand your ground and he was let go of by the police. Right. And then it was only months later, I believe it was 6 months later, that they actually did finally bring a special prosecutor and actually formally charge him. And there is that strong question of was that bringing him to justice, was that just out of national pressure.
Right.
So, for example, had this not caught the news, would he ever been arrested? And that's a strong question, because when you look at it, just from the principle of stand your ground, and George Zimmerman was following the young man, that goes against what that law states, which, like I say, which is why I do believe when he got down to actual formal trial, he didn't raise it because he knew he would lose that argument.
Yeah.
Because he brought himself to the quote unquote danger. And he also was, in my opinion, the instigator, because he accosted, after being told repeatedly by law enforcement, who we trust and pay and believe to maintain our safety, they told him, hey, leave it alone.
Are you following him? Yeah. Okay, we don't need you to do that. Okay.
He took it upon himself. He wasn't deputized as his neighborhood watch supervisor. He was an average everyday citizen with me who just happened to have a special title by his neighborhood.
Right.
But that still didn't give him any extra legal protection.
Yeah. It's like misguided vigilantism, basically. In his mind, he thought he was doing, I don't know what he thought he was doing.
Correct. And that's what gives people so much fear, or especially gun pundits, people who are anti, firearms. They feel like this turns everyone who has a firearm into a shoot first and ask questions later. And the law doesn't back up that. You know, you have to be able, especially when you start pulling your firearm, you got to be able to articulate the facts that, hey, I felt like my life was in danger, or the people in my near surroundings were in lawful danger. And I have to say lawful danger because if two criminals get to fight, two bank robbers rob a bank and then they come outside and they're fighting over the money and one shoots the other, there's no stand your ground because they're both criminals in that matter. But you have to be, if you have the right to lawfully defend anyone who is lawfully in your presence.
Yeah. How easy is it in states like Florida to get released quickly with no arrest just by claiming self-defense before much, if any, investigation? Is that something where, when an incident like this occurs, is that used a lot? Do people kind of raise that when they're in these situations, and how effective is that in general in those first initial stages?
Correct. So as far as self-defense, which, like I said earlier, stand your ground falls up under, it's just a added protection of self-defense. But self-defense, especially if there's some kind of violent, especially domestic situations or just overall violent situations between individuals, that pretty much, if there's any route to say I was defending myself, it's going to come out, even if it was not legally justified, even if it was not legally correct. People just about, I'm going to say, at least 8 out of 10 cases where there's conflict between individuals, it leads to violence. Somebody's going to try to claim I was just defending myself.
Yeah.
And that's when you get into witnesses and third parties and cameras that will show the true story. But also, saying that, it's still, as someone, even myself, as a personal gun owner myself, I pray I never have to use it, because in these circumstances, even if you are initially right, there can be steps. There's no guarantee that when you say, hey, I was defending myself, defending my property, lawfully defending myself in that situation, that the officer who comes on the scene is going to say, well, I agree with you, because they still can say, well, I don't believe you, and they can arrest you.
Yeah.
And if they arrest you, that puts you automatically in the system, but now you got to go before a judge to decide if you're going to get a bond. And then if you don't get a bond, then you got to go down a whole nother legal channel to request a bond. And they have in Georgia, up to 90 days to hold you before they have to either give you a bond or charge you. So you can be in the midst, and imagine in a society where most people live paycheck, easily you can lose anywhere from a day to months to 3 months before they even decide whether or not they're going to formally charge you.
Yeah.
And just, so going back to really answer your question, Dan, it really depends on your locality. What I mean, the officer who's on the scene, the prosecutor in that jurisdiction, the judge, it really does depend, because if the officer initially comes out on scene and say, I believe it was self-defense, I'm not going to charge him or arrest him or her. Okay, good. Now you just got to wait and see if a prosecutor's going to pick it up. But even with that, if the officer chooses to arrest you, you can sit for a minute. And if you, like I said, if someone ends up missing a week, 2 weeks, I've had so many cases where I saw individuals who were ultimately, the charges were either dropped, reduced, or if we push come to shove all the way to a trial, and they were found not guilty, but now they've suffered job loss, obviously financial, because as an attorney we don't work for free, and even someone who was to get a public defender, you still can have job loss. You can suffer broken families. It can just do so much damage. So that's what my word to people is, hey, if This is why it was intended to be, especially when deadly force was meant to be a last resort, because it can have great consequences even if you're found innocent.
Yeah. No, those are really good points to raise. Several studies, as we kind of touched on in the beginning, finding racial disparities and how stand your ground defense is effective in court. Obviously, this country and the world in general has this long, racial problematic history, but now we're in 2024. It's obvious, we're still in a place where we're working through these things and trying to make positive progress, and we have, but to the same degree, there's still a lot of problems with shootings and law enforcement and racial profiling, which obviously we touch on the George Zimmerman case certainly came into play there. In your opinion, are we at now, specifically in Georgia with this Ellenwood shooting, this kind of stuff it's always in the public consciousness, but there's times when it's more at the forefront, and then we kind of, other things come to the forefront and something gets pushed back in terms of the public conversation.
Right.
So can you just touch on kind of where we are now in terms of this specific law, stand your ground, the racial disparities and how it's been prosecuted, and kind of what is a path forward or a way for us to sort of approach this in a way that's more egalitarian or taking into consideration these disparities?
Right. And I think the major issue here is that we're focusing directly on stand your ground and the effects of it, but the overall system is broke.
Yes.
And that breakage in the system is just further permeated with stand your ground, because as I've spoken before, depending on where this individual is at, is going to decide whether or not they're going to have more credibility with the stand your ground, i.e., if someone's in their home, they're going to have a way stronger case, especially if someone can be shown coming in. They're going to have a way stronger case than someone's out here on the street. Like I say, stand your ground, and where you definitely see the racial disparities come in is if you're out here on these streets. If someone accosts another person, you can't say for sure why they did it. But because even we call about racial profiling, even look at Zimmerman. The Zimmerman situation goes back to this person was just in the neighborhood. Trayvon Martin had done nothing wrong. He had the right to be in his neighborhood.
Right.
But where we could pull the race in is that you get the racial profiling. And that racial profiling can permeate not only the initial act, but it can also at times permeate the law enforcement view of things, as well as the court system view on things. I tell everyone, even as the attorneys, we do our best to keep biases and prejudices, out. If a juror is biased or has some kind of prejudices, we do everything in our power to find that out.
Yeah.
But that's not a guarantee. So if I had cases like that, where people who had some individual just had some bones to pick with, someone just happened to be, I had a co-counsel in that case who was from that local small town and caught it.
Yeah. It's interesting you got there, because another thing that just came to mind, I'm from New York. In 2014, I was back in New York living there, was when the Eric Garner killing happened. And I specifically remember in that, I think it went to grand jury, and there was a lot of back and forth around this idea of like a special prosecutor and bringing that person in, which in my mind at the time, I was like, you sort of have to bring someone that's not connected to the precinct, because ultimately, if you bring in a prosecutor or a lawyer going after the police, and I know the situation isn't exactly what we're talking about here, but and there's a conflict of interest, right? You need to make sure that, to your point of removing biases as much as possible throughout the entirety of the system, which that's where I think functionally we can try to say, okay, it's broken. Where is it broken, right? And where can we kind of like apply tangible fixes to say this is never how it should have been, and we need to do it this way to remove bias, right? And to make sure someone's fairly prosecuted.
Correct. In our system, like I say, over the years, there's been multiple theories as far as the penalization of crimes. You've had some who believe in retribution and rehabbing the individual. You have some who believe in just locking this person away and throwing away the key.
Yeah.
And so finding the right approaches, especially when if it's a youth or something involved, and trying to set them on the right path is one of the biggest ways, I believe, to get the system unbroken. Because it's almost a proven study out there that shows you have someone who's may have a little simple crime, but they get locked up and they get put in there with hardened criminals. They learn to survive. So then they become hardened. Sometimes there's actually a theory out there that says criminals go to jail to become better criminals.
Yeah, I've heard that.
So it's like, what do you do? Do we try to change it around and focus more on, hey, Let's try to give people the skill set so they don't feel like they have to steal. Everyone knows there's always going to be some semblance of crime. Been crime around for decades, for centuries. But definitely if we can work overall on the socioeconomic factors that play a role, that can be a strong sense to getting the system fixed.
Yeah, and that benefits everybody.
Correct.
Like society and humanity as a whole benefits from us trying to be better and help
Correct.
each other be better and so on and so forth. You mentioned before you're a responsible gun owner. As a gun owner who, as we're touching on all this stuff, there's obviously a very difference between a responsible gun owner and a reckless gun owner. I mean, we see it over and over and over again. So what would you say to someone who thinks a stand your ground law could hypothetically justify the use of deadly force in the future? Obviously, that's sort of a vague question because it depends on each individual case. To your point, if you're genuinely doing stand your ground and you're saying, I'm not the aggressor and someone came after me, I would imagine then yes, you should be able to defend yourself. Correct. And not just get thrown out your back door, to your point of saying, hey, this is my house. I know it's castle doctrine.
No, correct.
Whatever, but how do you kind of see that in terms of the right way and the wrong way for the law and our system to use stand your ground if we're going to keep stand your ground?
Well, like I say, as you've already spoken to earlier, Dan, there's 38 states that have enacted some version of stand your ground. So when you got 50, 38 out of 50, that's way more than the majority. So I don't believe stand your ground is going to go anywhere. But for those individuals who are concerned about it, I think that if someone was going to shoot someone, they would do it with or without stand your ground. Because at the end of the day, all stand your ground does, it says that in the event that you were legally justified in what you've done, you will be protected by the law. It doesn't give you a badge to go out and just deputize yourself to go be a vigilante. Because at the end of it, like I say, even if you do all right with stand your ground, you still could face serious financial and legal consequences just from time standpoint. Because even if you're innocent, if you're not found innocent on the spot, then it could be months or years that you have had to have this hanging over your head. And like I said, seen people go bankrupt with it. So I don't believe, in my opinion, that it's going to deputize individuals. I just use myself personally. First and foremost, if I know where I'm going, I need my gun, I don't go.
Yeah.
Because it lets me know this is not a safe environment. This is somewhere I don't need to be in the first place. That gun is for in the event that if something happens and it's to a grave and life-threatening nature, I can defend me and my family. Those who are important to me. Because even if you, like I say, once you pull it, and the bullets are like words. Once they release, you cannot call them back. But you are responsible for everything that happens on the end of that bullet. Responsible gun owners, I don't feel like this is going to do anything. Those who are irresponsible would have been irresponsible regardless. Those are the same individuals who, before there was constitutional carry and you could carry a gun without a permit, were walking around with concealed weapons and without permits. These individuals who are going to be irresponsible are going to be irresponsible with or without stand your ground.
Yeah, that's well put. And again, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us here today on Unshut Cases. It was great having you. We hope to have you back very soon. Tell our audience where they can find you if they need your legal services anywhere in Georgia. How can they find your law firm?
We're located in South Atlanta in the Fayetteville area. But if you want to reach us, you can reach us at rrlegal.com. Or you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at RR Law. So check us out on those social media platforms. But don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any kind of legal issues involving family law, criminal, personal injury, or I forgot to mention, and my beautiful wife, who's also my law partner, she handles the intellectual property side of our firm and business formation side. So she does anything from business formations to, she's a licensed patent attorney, so she does patents and trademarks and other intellectual property issues. So definitely, if you have any legal issues to come up, please reach out to RL Law.
Awesome, Jonathan. Again, thank you so much, and we hope to have you back soon.
I thank you, Dan, for having me.